Yeah, I don't have any of the fancy, visual effects or studio editing software or all this other fine stuff. Not that I haven't looked around for some of it, but some of it's a bit pricey and some of it's just a bit complicated for me to understand right away, or to just really don't have enough time to devote to mastering yet another piece of technology just at the moment. Instead, Fat Man here, wanting to bring up and yet another set of rules that has a habit of being chunked, tossed, flipped, thrown, ignored, winked and nodded at, because they're no longer convenient, or somehow or another they disrupt the flow of narrative story play, which frankly, I'm 50, going on 52 years old, 52, halfway to dead, actually a little more than halfway to dead. This is the truth too. 40 years of gameplay, 42, 44, somewhere in there, right? I'm a little vague on remembering exact the year that I got my first game. 4 decades, right? And I have played tabletop board games and tabletop role games and video games and board games and homemade games and made up games and non-existent games and games only in my head. And I've done the story, and I've done the narrative, and I have. So, I get a little confused sometimes. I just get a little confused sometimes when I hear some people go on hardcore about this narrative storytelling. It's almost as if we're just going to tell a story, perhaps a player involved story, and not have any rules at all. No rules? Is that a game? Is that really a game? Okay. And if it is, and you're playing it and you're happy with it, fine, we're good with that. Because at the end of the day, that's the whole point of what we do, right? For the lion's share of us, that's what our point is, to entertain ourselves and our friends and our associates. So, it's all good. Okay, so why do we bother talking? Why do I bother bambling and rambling and bombastically going on and on and on about this stuff? Probably been done 500 times already. Probably gobs and gobs and gobs of text and blogs and videos, handwritten and classically typed, and some even published stuff on the topics, because there's value in revisiting these things. Sometimes for us old grognards, as it's called, to remind us of where our roots are and where we've come and where the hobby has come and how far it's advanced, to show that there's a good reason for a foundation of solid rules. Whether you apply them or not doesn't matter. The fact that they're there gives you some valuable tools in your toolbox if you need to make some sort of educated judgment call. If you're just firing from the hip in a narrative story style of storytelling, where at the end of the day you really have no rhyme or reason for structure or where you're going or what you want them to accomplish, I guess it doesn't matter, right? If you don't want to go out and invest a lot of money in a bunch of these books, hey, I get that, because this is not a cheap hobby. If you really want to get into it, it's not a cheap hobby. Alright, so what is my 4th installment of the most commonly chucked set of rules, or ignored set of rules? Would be weather. Now, if you think about it, encumbrance, subsistence, and travel are all magnified or affected by the conditions of the environment around the players, i.e., in this case, the weather. Now, I say to you simulationists, however you want to pronounce it, your narrativists, your storytelling yahoos, because we're all telling a story, regardless how much we lean on a stack of tomes or not. We're all still telling a story. We're all acting out an interactive story that is entertaining to everybody at the table, or they wouldn't be at the table. Neither would you, and you know that true. We don't just slog our way through this stuff day after day after day because we have to. This is not a job. It's an adventure, right? So, the weather, and we're going back for a minute. You look at just about any cinematic series, whether it be adventure, real life, symbolism, however you want to call it, at some point they usually toss in something to do with the weather. And the weather affects us on a day-by-day basis. We live with the weather every day. You know the effects of weather on yourself. You know how the effects of extreme cold affect you. Some people are much more immune to it than others. Not everybody will suffer exposure if left out to the extreme weather for an extreme period of time. But there are levels of tolerance within that. And yet, to suggest that every story, every narrative storytelling, simulus storytelling, wartop, whatever you want, a game table, what have you, video game, who goes out and has a beautiful, sunny, perfectly warm or perfectly chilly day every day. Well, there's a derogatory term that immediately came to mind. I thought, maybe we'll abbreviate to BS. Okay, that's just plain BS, and you know it. That's true a portion of the day, or a portion of the year, or a portion of the month. But here in the Midwest alone, and in other parts of the country, a few years ago, everybody was suffering from a drought. This year, we have too much water. Just crossing the average stream is a challenge. And while your adventurers are traveling from here to there, I don't advocate making them slog their way through every single obstacle they come across. The weather should still play some small part. It's just like in most TV series or movies, at some point the weather will make its appearance. Whether it is a backstop to show how it's just a miserable day and everybody's getting rained on, or it's very cold, or it's very hot, or to the extreme where the weather itself becomes an obstacle or an enemy, if even for a brief time. And going to the magic side of things, because we always want to add the magic to the thing, because that's part of the fun, right? But look at the sheer number of spells and prayers that are available, magic items that are available to either protect you from the elements, to control Mother Nature to some degree, to draw upon its vast power for enhancing magical abilities, or to circumvent it in some way, or to bring it up. You wouldn't have lightning bolts, you wouldn't have hailstorms, you wouldn't have if they didn't exist in nature. And as Rob puts it, in an alternate reality, an alternate realm, maybe you don't have that kind of problem. Maybe you're in a pocket dimension where the weather is perfectly controlled in an environment that's climate controlled 24/7. Even that by itself should be one of those possible lurking mysteries in the background of some of the adventures going, I wonder why it's always perfectly 75 degrees and sunny. I'm just pointing out, in my own personal campaigns and adventures that I've created over the years, I don't belabor the weather, I don't check on it constantly, but every now and then I do toss a random diet, because I know the basic environment at time of the year that the players are moving through, and so it's likely we're not going to see a blizzard in the middle of summer, but having a hailstorm or lightning storm or a tornado is plausible. Maybe even enough to add some flavor or tension for a moment as an encounter. Struggling to deal with a sudden squall as your sailing vessel is traveling down the coast. is reasonable, right? So having the fact that the books have covered to some degree the concept and the rules on making it easier to do that. And you know what? We're back to that. And I don't know how this has become a thing. This either or that we're latched onto lately. You're either a narratist or you're not. You're either a storyteller or you're a chunky, clunky, dice thumping, dice rolling, mechanists, simulist, where we're going to, Jesus, Rob, find a word that's easier for me to pronounce. I'm just saying. But why can't you have a little bit of both? You don't have to make this is a common mistake, or perhaps a common, maybe not so common misconception, that somehow or another, because you do honor the fact that you have a slew of rules or options for rules in your books, that tapping into them somehow or another makes you less of a storyteller. Okay. And if you're just storytelling the whole thing and barely touching the die at all, okay. But not having the fact, or not having advantage, or knowing that you have the advantage of pre-information, or the fact that enough people in the past have come up with these sets of rules, or these explanations for how things work, is that bad somehow? I guess I'm struggling with the concept here. So I'm tending to get off track a little bit. It's one of the reasons I don't do as many of these as live feeds as I could. And it just makes me ponder. One person that keeps coming to mind, and I'm not going to use her name, but she's becoming very hostile to the very concept of anything that doesn't somehow fit hand in hand, parcel and parcel, into how she feels the gaming should be run. It's almost as if she's on that cusp of being rude to the point of you're either with me or against me, which there's no such thing in this hobby. I'm sorry, but there isn't. There's enough room for everybody in every style. And it's actively encouraged. Everybody talks about every video I see, every other video, all of the commentary, for the lion's share, is supportive in some manner, and open-minded enough to allow room for everything. But the weather. Now, like I said, this particular book has expanded on various informations on the weather types, conditions, how they affect people in general, dressing for the weather, what happens when you're not dressed properly for the weather, and there's that ubiquitous, well, we're living a magic realm, we're just going to magically take care of everything. And that's fine. And if you're good with that, and you're good with maintaining that, that's also fine. When I go back to my argument when I talked about that under substance and travel, you're using these spell slots, and you're using them up. Or you're using mana, or you're using what have you in whatever powers the magic in your world. So that's one less spell available for defense or offense. It's just a defense of a different nature. Some of them have to be maintained and kept up. You can't just cast them once, but you got to cast them on a daily basis, and sometimes an hourly basis, depending on the extremes. And then there's the the additional expense of materials and or time. We also have the fact we have to go back with encumbrance. Of course, we're doing that wink and a nod, and we're ignoring encumbrance. But if you're a well-traveled adventurer, is going to see several changes in the environment that are significant enough to warrant carrying a change of weather clothes. That takes up more space and weight. Having a set of winter clothes and a summer clothes. And back in the day, we didn't have this massive breakdown of different types of items of clothing, and I don't think it has ever come up. I've yet to come across a splat book or source book, excuse me, that's dominated by that sort of thing, which weirdly enough, I would welcome a book of that nature to some degree, and I mean an equipment guide per se for clothing or attire, for no other reason, just having a variety of items and options for NPCs and or players, and the information that pertains. You know, that's obviously one of my attractions to this beloved hobby, is the fact that we have so many different books, and you can read up on numerous topics and subjects and become at least moderately versed in them, and apply them as needed or as wished in whatever elements or levels of comfort to your campaign. Adding weather in my campaign is always something. I'm not going to let this run into a half hour if I can help it, but and there's always the butt with the fat man. It's a fat man and a big butt. Yeah, it's a joke. It's a joke, son. It's a joke. Okay, fine. I'll tell you a little bit of a piece from one of my main game ventures from 6 years ago. It was Two Dwarves in a Wagon. Ooh, you know, I had 7 hours of sleep and I can't stop yawning. It's the nature of the hours I keep. Two Dwarves in a Wagon. I had a short group. One of our players had to leave, and another one, I don't know, we had to dismiss him from the table because he was a nut job. You know, that's I've done videos on that in the past, and there's a current comment, you know, on the brigade channel on the topic. So, you know, but we were down to 2 players, and we went from a Star Wars campaign, and they decided, well, let's do some D&D for this go around. I said, okay. So my idea was, 2 dwarves have to get a job. They work for a big dwarven citadel, find themselves as teamsters, driving a supply wagon, and making basically a circle around a certain part of the region, stopping at several villages, towns, and outposts that are either friendly to or doing business with or maintained by the dwarves and in general. And at one point, they had encountered I don't want to say, it's not a wizard, but a merchant a merchant and a shop that specializes in catering to the material needs of spellcasters. So having a variety of oddball substances in jars and containers and bundles and stuff in the shop is kind of imperative. So looking to pick up some extra coin, and I was very tight-fisted on the coins in this campaign. I wanted these sellers to play close to the hilt, like they were real teamsters, real workers, not warriors per se, and not having huge piles of dragon gold laying around for them to expand. So they worked and come up with very creative ways to find every silver piece that they could get their hands on, and copper pieces, and it added up. You know, not some grand, huge pile, but it did add up. One of them was to go out of their way occasionally to pick up or search or harvest component material. So it was rumored that the certain plant that flowered during a certain time of the year grew in a very marshy environment, and the shop proprietor told them where they could find this environment, which was just a little bit off the beaten track from the road that they were commonly traveling. So when they got there, they found this old wood logging road, if you will, followed it back up into the marshy area, and where this ruin of an ancient Druidic church or something was poking out of this what could be a swamp, bordering on a swamp marshy area. And in the process, driving the heavy loaded wagon off the road, they had to deal with some road issues because it wasn't much of a road, and the ground was pretty dry and stuff when they went back in there. And then during the middle of the night, they had a horrific thunderstorm break loose with high winds and other issues. Now, oddly enough, in the real world, that sort of thing had actually occurred. Locally speaking, which is what inspired me to throw it out the next day as an encounter. So when we played, a woke up in the middle of the night to this horrific storm and had to run around and batten down the hatches, so to speak, make sure that the team was well secured so they didn't bolt and run away. They didn't have to dodge any lightning bolts, but there was a couple of heavy gusts of wind, and they had to deal with that sort of thing. It didn't last long. I mean, neither the bad weather nor their need to cope with it, but I did have them make a few rolls, and I let them figure out, as what they're supposed to do, those players, how to cope with the situation and what best to do to secure their little campsite and protect their stuff. Then, the next day, we had them go and try to get out, and the trek was much muddier, much harder to get through, and there was a couple knocked down trees. This involved some lifting and cutting and a few bits of that and the other thing. Nothing that was life-threatening but for the players, they enjoyed themselves. I enjoyed myself. It was a way to spice up that particular session of the campaign, and it gave them some fuel for later stories telling around the bars and things like that, the great terrible windstorm of blah blah blah. And it was just a good, interesting thing where nobody had to get killed, nobody had to murder anything or attack anything, and they were challenged, and they gained experience for the challenge. So, my take on that sort of thing, whether your friend or foe, and yet another encounter. So as always, my friends, the rules are not necessarily there to make you do anything, add anything, force you to do stuff or to not do stuff. They're just there to give you options and to show that somebody else has thought of this and have tried to take into account how best to cope with it. And that's the base gist of it. At the end of the day, we play as we play as you want, and you're happy and you're comfortable with your style. None of this matters, right? But you never know. One idea can crop up from any place and any time, and having access to this stuff is a good thing, in my opinion. As always, in my opinion. So, until the next one, game on.